The river came up on a Tuesday in late March, and by Thursday, it had gone back down to its banks like nothing happened, leaving behind a field that no longer looked like a field at all. Marnie Colber stood at the edge of what used to be 40 acres of hay ground outside Ashwell, Wisconsin, a small dairy town on the west branch of the Kickapoo River, and looked at a sight she couldn't quite make sense of. The flood had scoured out a bend 2 miles upstream, taken down a stand of old cottonwood and white pine along a logging road that hadn't been maintained since the 70s, and dropped the whole mess on her family's bottomland like a shipwreck. Whole trunks, 20 and 30 feet long, root wads the size of trucks, splintered fence posts, a chunk of somebody's dock, a green plastic kayak wedged 14 feet up in the fork of a dead elm that was still standing, somehow in the middle of it all. 40 tons, the county extension agent guessed later when he came out to look at the erosion. 40 tons of driftwood sitting on land that was supposed to be growing alfalfa in 6 weeks. Marnie was 31 years old that spring, and she had come back to Ashwell 2 years earlier after her marriage ended in Madison, where she'd been doing back office work for a health insurance company, and where, in her words, she had stopped recognizing her own week. The farm had belonged to her grandfather, then her father, and after her father's stroke, it had mostly sat rented out to a neighbor who ran beef cattle on the pasture and hayed the bottomland. She'd moved back into the old farmhouse with a plan that amounted to figuring it out, which is not much of a plan, and had spent 2 winters mostly failing to figure it out, keeping a small flock of laying hens and taking shifts at the feed mill in town to make the mortgage her father had, against all advice, refinanced in his last competent year. So when the flood took the hay ground and buried it in wreckage, the sensible thing, the thing everyone told her to do, was to call it a loss on the crop insurance, hire someone with a track loader to shove it all into a burn pile, and get the field back to grass by next spring. Her neighbor Dale Vetch, who leased the ground, came by and said as much, standing with his hands in his coveralls pockets, looking at the wreck like it had personally offended him. "That's 40 tons of nothing," he said. "Best thing you can do is burn it and disc it under." She agreed with him, out loud, and then she didn't do it. What stopped her wasn't a plan. It was that she walked out into the wreck the next morning with a cup of coffee, mostly just to see it up close, and found a section of cottonwood trunk about 6 feet long that had been scoured smooth and silver gray by the water and sand, the bark stripped clean off, the grain standing up in ridges like something had been carved into it on purpose. It didn't look like garbage. It looked like it had been waiting a long time to look like that. She didn't know anything about wood, but she stood there long enough that Dale honked at her from the road, and she still didn't move. The first thing she learned was that driftwood is not the same as timber, and that distinction cost her nearly 3 months. She had it in her head, reasonably enough, that a log was a log, and that if she could get some of the bigger pine trunks milled into boards, she'd have lumber for something. She wasn't sure what yet, maybe just to sell rough cut at the sawmill supply store in Lafarge. She rented a chainsaw mill, Alaskan-style rig that clamps to a bar and lets you cut slabs freehand, and spent a weekend cutting into a 22-foot pine trunk that had been sitting in the wreck pile for going on 4 months by then. The first cut destroyed her chain in about 11 seconds. The wood was full of sand, packed into every crack and fissure from months of being dragged along a riverbed, and sand does to a saw chain what it does to anything else that moves against it. It grinds the cutting edges down to nothing almost instantly. She went through 3 chains before a man at the hardware store in Viroqua asked her, not unkindly, whether she'd washed the logs first. She had not thought to wash the logs first. The second failure was slower and cost her more. She got a batch of slabs cut, cottonwood mostly, because it was straight and plentiful, and stacked them in her pole barn to dry, the way she'd read you were supposed to, boards laid flat with sticks between each layer for airflow. Within 6 weeks, half of them had cupped and cracked so badly they were firewood. Riverine wood, it turned out, holds moisture unevenly, because it's been sitting partly submerged, partly exposed, for months, sometimes years, and the outer inch dries much faster than the core unless you control the process. She had also cut the slabs too thick and too fast, at a green moisture content that a book she finally bought said should have been air-dried for a full year per inch of thickness, minimum, before even thinking about a kiln. She hadn't waited a month. The third failure was the one that made her cry in the barn, which she wasn't proud of, but she counted it later as the most useful bad day of that whole year. She'd found what she thought was the prize of the pile, a black walnut trunk, nearly 3 feet across, clean and solid-looking, that must have come down out of somebody's yard a long way upstream. She paid a portable sawyer $60 an hour to come mill it into thick slabs for what she'd decided, by then, she wanted to make. A live edge table, something people paid real money for at the furniture shops in Madison. 6 hours in, on the third slab, the band saw blade hit something buried dead center in the log, and kicked so hard it nearly took the sawyer's hand off. A fence staple, rusted through, grown 3 inches deep into the heartwood, invisible from the outside. He'd checked with a metal detector, he said, but a cheap one, and this one hadn't beeped. It ruined the blade, cost her the rental time, and turned 4,000 board feet of what might have been beautiful walnut into scrap, because you cannot sell a table with a nail track through the middle of it, not at any price, and you cannot trust a piece of riverwood without checking it properly. That was when Arlen Prasser started showing up. Arlen was 78, a widower who lived 2 farms down and had spent 40 years as a Finnish carpenter and cabinet maker before his hands got too stiff with arthritis to hold a chisel steady. Marnie had known him her whole life the way you know an old neighbor, which is to say barely, mostly through her father, who used to trade eggs for Arlen's help fixing machinery. He didn't come to help. He came, he told her later, because he'd been driving past for months, watching her make every mistake he'd made 40 years earlier, and it was killing him not to say anything. He didn't say much even then. He walked the wreck pile with her one October afternoon, tapping logs with a hatchet handle, listening to the sound they made, and told her 3 things that whole visit. First, sand kills chains, wash everything, and a good stiff brush and a garden hose before you cut anything will save you more money than any tool you'll ever buy. Second, metal detector, the real kind, the kind loggers use for millwood, not a beech one. Riverwood eats fence wire, spikes, cable, all of it, and it grows the metal in so deep you'll never see it coming. Third, and this was the one he said twice, once that day and once again 18 months later in a way that finally landed. Wood doesn't care how bad you want it dry. It'll only give up water as fast as it wants to. She didn't fully understand that second time hearing it either, not until she lost an entire batch of slabs to case hardening the following summer, cutting the drying time short by running a kiln too hot too early, which locks stress into the outer fibers while the core is still wet, so that the boards look dry and then split open weeks later, sometimes in the middle of being planed. That was failure number 4, and it was the expensive one, because by then, she wasn't drying a barn's worth of slabs. She was drying what she'd started calling her inventory. Between the walnut disaster and the case hardening, though, something had shifted, mostly by accident. A woman from Reedstown named Colleen Aldine had seen a stack of the silver-gray cottonwood boards leaning against Marnie's barn, the scoured, weathered pieces, not the fresh-milled slabs, and asked if she could buy 4 of them to make a headboard. Marnie hadn't even priced them. She said $30 a board and took the $120 feeling like she'd gotten away with something. That was the first sale, in November, 14 months after the flood, and it barely covered the chainsaw chains she'd ruined getting to that point. But it told her something the walnut table never could have. People wanted the wood to look like what it was. They didn't want her to plane away the flood. They wanted the silver patina, the worm tracks, the places where sand and current had carved the grain into ridges, no sander could fake. That reframed the whole project. She stopped trying to make furniture-grade lumber out of driftwood pine and started paying attention to what the river had already done for free. Arlen, when she told him this, nodded like it wasn't news. "Boy, that's the whole trade," he said. "You're not fighting the wood, you're finishing what the water started." From there, the growth was slow and specific, each stage built on the one before it actually working, not on hope. The headboard sale led to a booth at the Vernon County Craft Fair the following June, where she brought a folding table of small items, cutting boards from clean-grained maple, a few driftwood picture frames, a lamp base made from a burled root wad Arlen had helped her stabilize with epoxy in the hollows. She sold about $400 of goods over 2 days, which felt enormous at the time, and more importantly, a woman running a farm-to-table restaurant in Viroqua asked if Marnie could build her a set of serving boards to match the restaurant's rustic aesthetic. River-washed edges left natural, tops planed flat and food-safe. That was the first real account. 18 boards at $45 each, delivered over 2 months, and Marnie had to learn, fast, the difference between a decorative finish and a food-safe one, which meant switching from a polyurethane to a mineral oil and beeswax blend that needed reapplying but wouldn't leach anything into a customer's steak. The restaurant boards got photographed for the restaurant's website, and that photograph did more for her than the craft fair had. A contractor in La Crosse building custom homes for people with money and no patience for drywall reached out asking whether she could supply mantel beams, full timber pieces, not slabs, 6 to 8 feet long, with the flood patina left visible. That was a bigger swing. It meant learning to work with whole cants instead of thin slabs, learning to stabilize larger checks and cracks with butterfly keys, bow-tie-shaped inlays that Arlen taught her to cut and fit by hand because a crack that isn't structurally locked will keep opening no matter how good the wood looks the day you deliver it. Her first mantel beam for that contractor split along an old check line 4 months after installation in a house with forced air heat running all winter because she hadn't accounted for how much drier a modern house is than a barn, and she'd left the moisture content half a point too high. She ate the cost of replacing it and gave the homeowner a bigger, better beam for free, and the contractor, instead of dropping her, respected that enough to send her 2 more houses that year. By the 3rd year, she wasn't just selling pieces, she was selling herself as somebody who understood a specific, strange material that nobody else in 3 counties had bothered to learn. She built a small kiln, a solar kiln actually, a design Arlen had seen in a woodworking magazine decades back. A simple insulated box with a clear polycarbonate roof that used greenhouse heat and a couple of small fans to bring boards down slowly and evenly without the stress cracking of a fast conventional kiln. It cost her about $6,000 to build, most of it borrowed against the farm, and it let her dry a real volume of lumber, a few thousand board feet at a time, in 6 to 10 weeks instead of the year-plus open-air drying required, which finally let her take on bigger commissions with real deadlines. The commission that changed everything came in her 4th year, and it grew directly out of the mantel work. A couple from Minneapolis, who'd bought 60 acres up the ridge from her as a weekend retreat, wanted a small guest cabin built almost entirely from reclaimed flood timber, structural beams, siding, flooring, the whole thing, with the story of where the wood came from told on a little plaque by the door, because people who buy that kind of house also want to buy the story. Marnie didn't build the cabin herself. She wasn't a carpenter and knew it. She partnered with a timber frame builder out of Coon Valley, supplying and preparing all the wood, sorting for structural soundness, kiln drying to the 7 or 8% moisture content needed for framing lumber, cutting siding boards that kept the silvered patina on the outward face, milling flooring from the cleanest cottonwood and ash cants she had, each board individually checked with the metal detector Arlen had insisted on 4 years earlier. That project, timber supply and preparation only, billed out at just under $60,000 over 8 months. But it also became the portfolio piece. Photographs of the finished cabin, the ridgeline beams still showing faint scour marks from the river, the front door threshold cut from a single slab of burled elm root, ran in a regional home and garden magazine, with a caption explaining that all the timber had come from a single flood event on the Kickapoo. From that article came 4 more cabin inquiries within a year, 2 of which she took on with the same builder, and by the time the second full cabin was finished, the total value of that one, materials, her labor supplying and finishing the wood, her share of the build coordination, came to just over $200,000, spread across a project that took the better part of a year. Dale Vetch, who'd told her to burn the pile 5 years earlier, ended up being one of her suppliers. His pasture ran along a stretch of river that flooded every few years, and after watching what she'd built, he started calling her every spring instead of clearing debris himself, letting her come pull logs off his fence lines for a modest fee per truckload instead of paying to have them hauled to the county burn site. 40 tons of nothing, he said to her once, at her own kitchen table, with something close to a laugh in his voice. Guess I was wrong about the number. Arlen didn't live to see the second cabin finished. He died that January, quietly, in his sleep, at 83, and Marnie found out later from his daughter that he'd told people around town, more than once, that the Colber girl was the only one who'd ever really listened to him about wood, and that most of what he knew was going to die with him except for what he'd managed to hand off to her. At the small service in the Lutheran church in Ashwell, Marnie thought about the line he'd said to her twice. Wood doesn't care how bad you want it dry, it'll only give up water as fast as it wants to, and understood, finally, all the way through, that it wasn't really about lumber. It was about the 5 years it had taken her to become someone who knew what she was doing, and how none of the failures could have been skipped, no matter how much she'd wanted to skip them. She still lives on the farm outside Ashwell. The bottomland grows hay again, most of it, but she's left a low stretch along the river, unmowed and unplanted on purpose, a kind of unofficial catch basin, because the river floods that bend every 4 or 5 years, whether anyone wants it to or not, and when it does, it still brings wood down with it. She has a name for the business now, Kickapoo Driftwood Timber, a small shop building where the pole barn used to be, 2 employees she trained herself, and a waiting list for cabin and mantel work that runs about 14 months out. When people ask her how she learned it, she tells them the truth, which is that she didn't learn it fast, and she didn't learn it from a book, and that most of what she knows came from ruining things until an old man with bad hands finally told her, in about 9 words at a time, what she was doing wrong. What she doesn't tell people, because it takes longer to explain and doesn't fit neatly into a magazine caption, is how much of the early knowledge came from things that had nothing to do with woodworking books and everything to do with paying attention to a river she'd grown up next to without ever really looking at. She learned, for instance, that not all driftwood is created equal, and that species matters as much as any technique she picked up. Cottonwood, which made up the bulk of what came down in that first flood, is a soft, fast-growing tree, and it rewards you for working with the grain instead of against it. It takes a scoured, silvered patina beautifully because its open pore structure holds on to whatever the water and sand did to it, but it's also prone to punky rot in the heartwood if it sat wet too long before she got to it. So every log had to be sounded out first, tapped with a mallet, listened to for a dull thud instead of a clean knock, before she'd commit saw time to it. White pine, of which there was less but which she prized more, held up better structurally and took stain evenly, which made it good for beams, but it was pitchy, full of resin pockets that would gum up a blade if she didn't let it cure longer before milling. Black walnut, when it wasn't hiding a fence staple in its heart, was the most valuable wood by far, worth 2 or 3 times what cottonwood brought per board foot, but it was rare in her flood debris, maybe 1 good trunk in every 20 tons, and she learned to recognize it from 30 yards off by the almost purplish cast to the wet bark and the smell, faintly like pickle brine, when she cut into it fresh. Ash was its own lesson entirely, and a hard one. The emerald ash borer had been working its way through the Kickapoo Valley for years by the time the flood hit, and a good portion of the ash trunks she found in the debris were already dead standing timber before the water ever took them down, killed by the beetle and weakened at the base until high water simply pushed them over. That wood was often riddled with the borer's winding S-shaped galleries just under the bark, which ruined it for anything requiring structural integrity, but made it, oddly, some of her most popular decorative material. People liked the texture, the story of a tree killed by an invasive insect and then reclaimed by a flood, turned into a serving tray or a small side table. She had to learn to distinguish, by cutting a test wedge, whether the galleries went only skin deep or had compromised the wood all the way through, because using compromised ash in anything load-bearing was a liability she couldn't afford to discover after the fact. There was also the matter of drying schedules, which Arlen had drilled into her long after the case-hardening disaster, and which she came to treat almost as scripture. The rule of thumb he gave her, roughly 1 year of air drying per inch of thickness before you dare put a board in a kiln, was conservative, he admitted. Some species and some conditions could move faster, but he'd rather she lose time than lose wood, because time was cheap, and a ruined slab of black walnut was not. Her solar kiln, once she had it running properly, let her take partially air-dried stock, usually 6 months to a year old already, and bring it the rest of the way down to a stable moisture content over 6 to 10 weeks, checking it every few days with a handheld pin moisture meter, watching the numbers come down slowly, 0.5 percentage point some days, nothing at all on humid ones, because the whole design depended on gentle heat and controlled airflow rather than brute force temperature. Push it too fast, even in that kiln, and she'd get the same case-hardening problem all over again. The shell of the board drying and shrinking while the core stayed swollen, locking in internal stress that would show up weeks or months later as cups, twists, or the worst outcome, boards that split explosively once someone started planing them, releasing all that pent-up tension at once. She kept a chart taped inside the kiln door, one she'd built herself from Arlen's old notes and her own trial and error, matching species and thickness to expected drying time, and she still updated it every year with new numbers as she learned more. The metal detection process became almost a ritual by the 3rd year, something she did with the same seriousness a surgeon might bring to scrubbing in. Every log, before it touched a blade, got run over slowly with a commercial-grade detector, the kind sawmills use, sensitive enough to find a nail an inch under bark, but not so sensitive it screamed at every trace mineral in the wood itself. She'd mark suspect spots with orange spray paint, then go at them by hand with a hatchet, exposing whatever metal was buried there before it ever got near a moving blade. She still found things that made her shake her head. A horseshoe grown 4 inches into a log, a chunk of rebar, once, memorably, half of a bicycle handlebar swallowed by an oak that must have grown around a bike left leaning against it decades earlier, and long since fallen. Every piece of metal she pulled out went into a coffee can on her workbench, and by the 5th year the can was full enough that she'd started giving pieces away to customers who wanted a small memento of what their table or beam had survived. Growth kept chaining forward in ways that made sense only in hindsight. The magazine article about the first cabin brought her not just new clients, but a phone call from a distributor in the Twin Cities who supplied reclaimed and specialty lumber to architects and high-end furniture makers across the upper Midwest. He didn't want cabins. He wanted consistent, graded stock, book-matched slabs mostly, wide single boards cut from the same log and laid open like the pages of a book so the grain mirrored itself across a seam, the kind of thing that sold for real money to people building conference tables and reception desks in Minneapolis and Chicago. That meant learning an entirely new set of standards, consistent thickness tolerances, moisture content certified with a meter reading logged for each piece, grading for defects the way a commercial mill would grade, rather than simply selling whatever looked good enough for a farmhouse kitchen. It also meant, for the first time, real quality control failures that had nothing to do with the wood itself and everything to do with her own systems. She lost her first wholesale account with him after shipping a batch of book-matched walnut slabs that had been stored, over a humid August, in a corner of her shop that didn't get good airflow. 3 of the 8 slabs developed faint blue-gray staining from mold that hadn't been visible when she packed them, but bloomed during transit and sat there waiting for the distributor to unwrap them in Minneapolis. He sent the whole shipment back. It cost her nearly $4,000 in materials and freight both ways. And more than that, it cost her his trust for the better part of a year, during which she had to rebuild the account almost from scratch, this time with better airflow in her storage racks, and a strict rule that nothing left her shop without sitting in conditioned space for at least 2 weeks prior to shipping, so any hidden moisture problems would show themselves before a customer ever saw them. She earned the account back the slow way, the only way that ever really worked in her experience by then, by being right, consistently, more times than she was wrong, until the distributor stopped double-checking her moisture readings against his own meter and started just taking her word for it. That relationship alone, by year 6, was worth close to $30,000 a year in steady wholesale business, on top of the custom commission work, and it gave her something the commissions never could, which was predictability, a floor under the business that didn't depend on the next flood or the next magazine article. Not that the floods stopped. The Kickapoo flooded again in her 3rd year, a smaller event, maybe 8 tons of new debris rather than 40, and again in her 6th, a bigger one that rivaled the original. By then she had a system for it that would have seemed impossible to the woman standing in her ruined hayfield with a cup of coffee years earlier. She had a network of neighbors up and down that stretch of river, Dale among them, who called her the moment water started pulling debris loose, and she had a flatbed trailer and a permit arrangement with the county that let her pull wood off public right-of-way after a flood event instead of letting it get bulldozed into a burn pile, which is what happened to almost all of it before she started. County road crews, who used to spend a week hauling flood debris to a burn site every few years, started calling her directly instead, because it saved them the disposal cost and got the debris off the roadside faster, and she paid them nothing for it beyond the fuel and time it took her crew to sort what was worth keeping from what genuinely was scrap. Her father, whose stroke had left him with slurred speech, but a mind that stayed sharp, came out in his wheelchair the day she finished the solar kiln, the one Arlen had shown her the design for, and sat under the shade of the pole barn, watching her run the fans for the first time. He couldn't say much, but he pointed at the stack of drying cottonwood inside the polycarbonate roof and made a sound that she'd learned, over 2 years, meant something like pride, though it took her a while to be sure that's what it was, rather than confusion. He died the following spring, before the 2nd cabin was finished, and she buried him on a clear, cold day in the small cemetery outside Ashwell, not far from where Arlen had been laid to rest, a little over a year earlier. She thought, standing there, that both men had left her something that didn't show up on any balance sheet. One had left her the land and the debt that came with it, without meaning to, and the other had left her the knowledge to turn a liability into the thing that eventually paid the debt off entirely, which it did, in the 8th year, when she made the final payment on the mortgage her father had taken out, and felt, for the first time since she'd come back to Ashwell, like the ground under her was actually hers. These days, when flood season comes around, people in town don't groan the way they used to about the debris and the disposal costs and the fields it ruins. They still worry about the erosion, the lost hay ground, the fences that need rebuilding, because those problems are real and she'd never pretend otherwise. But somewhere along the way, the reflexive dread got a second thought attached to it, a kind of running joke that isn't entirely a joke. Somebody will say, half laughing, that at least Marnie'll have something to work with this year. She still winces a little at that, because she knows better than anyone that it costs her real money and real labor to turn a flood into lumber, that it's never once been easy money, that every board she's ever sold came from a log that had to be washed, sounded, scanned, cut, dried slowly enough not to ruin it, and finished with a patience she'd had to learn from a man who was gone now. But she doesn't correct them. She just goes out, when the water finally drops, with her coffee and her flatbed trailer and her metal detector, and starts walking the new pile the river left behind, looking for what's worth saving.